Plutarch's historical research. In the introduction to each biography, there is a brief discussion of its historical setting and Plutarch's sources, but certain issues and certain writers are relevant to every life included here. The period spanning from Romulus to Aemilius Paulus was a vast one, and it is testimony to Plutarch's deep reading and industry that he can cover so much historical territory. Plutarch read widely, taking detailed notes and also relying on what undoubtedly was a capacious memory. When it came to writing his biographies, however, his practice, sensible in a world constrained to use cumbersome scrolls instead of more easily accessible books or databases, was for long stretches to follow a single source, which he then supplemented or corrected on the basis of his comprehensive research. Modern scholars are naturally interested in Plutarch's sources and the uses to which he puts them. Plutarch is responsible for his own ethical observations, and he is very fond of digressions which he supplies out of his own erudition. Nor, even when he is guided by a single source, is Plutarch a mere copyist. He expresses every episode in his own distinctive literary style, shaping it to suit the moral purposes of the life in which it appears. It is owing to this preoccupation that Plutarch sometimes abridges his sources, or conflates certain historical episodes, or violates the chronology of his narrative by displacing material from various periods of his subject's life in order to illustrate what he deems an important aspect of the man's character, all practices that occasionally frustrate or irritate modern historians. But how good were Plutarch's sources? Any casual reader of Livy or Dionysius of Halicarnassus could feel justified in drawing the conclusion that the history of early Rome was fairly well known to the Romans and therefore reasonably accessible to Plutarch and to us. This, however, would be a serious error. Although eventually the Romans worked out a cohesive and very exciting account of their origins and their rise as an Italian power, it was based on a good deal of legend, surmise, and guesswork, which is why their account of their early history creaks. For instance, the Romans once believed, on the basis of Greek authorities going back to the 5th century BCE, that their city was founded after the fall of Troy, late in the 2nd millennium, which made sense if Rome was founded by Aeneas or any other refugee from the Trojan War. Later, however, they came to the view, again on the basis of Greek scholarship, that their city was more or less the same age as Carthage, Rome's greatest rival. And so the city's foundation date was shifted to the 8th century BCE. Still, the Romans-Trojan connection was preserved, and in the end, one version at least, Aeneas brought the Trojan remnant to Italy, where he founded the city of Alba Longa. The generations later, Romulus and Remus, true princes of Alba Longa, after expelling tyranny from their native city, founded Rome. This account, which probably owes itself to Greek invention, never entirely succeeded in shifting its numerous competitors. They could still be studied well into the empire, as Plutarch amply demonstrates in his long rehearsal of them in the opening chapters of his Romulus. Again, this goes way back to the kingdom of Rome. It is remarkable, but true, that in many ways we know more about early Rome than did Roman historians, or of the Republic, or the Empire. The material evidence of the city, for instance, makes it plain that Rome was never founded in a single go. Instead, early inhabitations ultimately congealed into an urbanized settlement, the understandable disorder of which the Romans explained by appealing to the haste with which the survivors of the Gallic sack rebuilt their ruined city. To take another example, the Romans very early on forgot that after the fall of the monarchy, their government was first led by a single magistrate called the Praetor Maximus, or literally the chief leader, a post soon replaced by 2 consuls. Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, however, speak of consuls from the start, and the Romans' own accounts of the expulsion of the Tarquins and the establishment of the Republic were so cluttered by competing stories that in the end they settled on a tradition whereby, in the first year of the Republic, they were governed by no fewer than 5 consuls, whose stories sit together uncomfortably. This early period was poorly known because the writing of history came late to Rome. As we have seen on the topic of Roman history, the Romans were anticipated by the Greeks, who began making observations about Rome as early as the 5th century BCE. The first true historians of Rome were the Greek Hieronymus of Cardia from 360 to 256 BCE, and Timaeus of Tauromenium, 356 to 260 BCE. Hieronymus, in writing about the invasion of Italy by Pyrrhus of Epirus, 319 to 272 BCE, included a detailed account of early Rome. Timaeus, who composed an influential history of the Western Mediterranean world in 38 books, integrated the history of Rome into the established chronology of Greek events, a project he furthered in his own narrative of the Pyrrhic War, from 280 to 278 and 275 BCE. The beginnings of Roman history then lay outside of Rome. Quintus Fabius Pictor, a senator active in the Second Punic War, from 218 to 201 BCE, was Rome's first historian. Writing shortly before 200 BCE and writing in Greek, he gave his readers an account of Roman history from the mythical days of Hercules down to his own time. He set a fashion of senatorial historiography in Greek that continued into the elder Cato, 234 to 149 BCE, late in his life, composed his Origins. This was the first Roman history ever written in Latin, and it was only afterwards that the Romans embraced the practice of writing their history in their own language. But what were their sources? It will be obvious how much historians of early Rome depended on Greek sources, whose methods for recovering the facts of the monarchy or early republic we cannot now evaluate. Of archival material for early Rome, there was little. Legends and antiquarian speculations, by contrast, were ample and no doubt credited. Family traditions, boastful and unverifiable, also enlarged and aggrandized Roman traditions, even if some Romans were inclined to take them with a pinch of salt. See Cicero's Brutus or Livy. Nor were Roman historians shy in trying to recreate their past by way of applying the events of their recent history to ancient situations. The narratives in Livy that recount early Republican discord rely heavily on the social conflicts experienced during the late Republic, not on contemporary evidence. There is not much here to inspire unqualified confidence. The Romans themselves were skeptical about their history prior to the Gallic sack of 390 BCE, a point made explicitly by Livy, as soon as he gets past that point in his narrative. And we must remain dubious about Roman history before the invasion of Italy by Pyrrhus of Epirus, when at last contemporary witnesses began to shape available accounts. Matters improved significantly thereafter. Fabius Pictor, now ever partisan, was a contemporary or near contemporary of the events he narrated in his latter books. The Punic Wars and Rome's expansion into the eastern Mediterranean attracted the attention of numerous historians, Greek and Roman alike, writing from more than one perspective, and so from the 3rd century BCE onwards, we possess histories that, while imperfect and incomplete, can be deemed satisfactorily grounded in reliable research. The most important of these sources for many of the biographies in this volume is Polybius, from around 200 to 118 BCE. He was a rising statesman in the Achaean League, as a consequence of which he found himself among the prominent Achaeans, deported to Rome in the aftermath of the Third Macedonian War, from 171 to 168 BCE. There he became friendly with several important senators, most crucially with Aemilius Paulus, who became his patron, and Paulus's son Quintus Fabius Maximus and Scipio Aemilianus. While in Rome, Polybius directed his energies toward the literary composition, the most important result of which was his Histories, a work in 40 books that attempted to explain how in the period between the end of the First Punic War from 264 to 241 BCE and the conclusion of the Third Macedonian War, the Romans acquired, for better or worse, their worldwide domination. He later expanded his project down to the year 145 BCE just to investigate whether it was better or worse. Polybius was a universal historian. That is, his account included important events conducted by Carthaginians and Greeks, as well as by Romans. In the end, his detailed, impeccably researched, and knowledgeable treatment of this period isolated several causes for Rome's success, one of them being a world historical force he identifies with Tyche, or fortune. Polybius became the essential source for latter writers interested in any aspect of Roman history covered in the Histories, as well as in the rise of the Achaean League. He surprisingly pays a great deal of attention to the history of his native state. Consequently, his treatment of events strongly influenced Livy, and it makes a crucial contribution to Plutarch's narratives in various lies, including those of Fabius Maximus, Marcellus Aratus, Philopoemen, Flaminius, and Aemilius Paulus. Furthermore, it is increasingly clear that Plutarch saw in Polybius an important antecedent to his own intellectual project. Polybius, like Plutarch, was a Greek expert in Roman society, and his histories, by way of its universality, elevated Greek affairs to a rough equivalence with Roman ones. It also is the case that Polybius, like Plutarch, though with less philosophical rigor, intended his exposition of the past to contribute to the moral improvement of his readers. Polybius was much honored by the Romans and in his native Greece, and in him Plutarch detected a model of dignified and scholarly compliance with the political realities of Roman power. For the lives in this volume, Plutarch often draws on Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek rhetorician, critic and historian resident in Rome during the 1st century BCE. His Roman Antiquities in 20 books begins with the origins of Rome and carries down to the time of the First Punic War. It is a work very much in dialogue with Polybius, an author who writes so poorly, Dionysius complains in a critical essay, no one can bear to read him all the way through. See his essay on the arrangement of words. Dionysius of Halicarnassus concentrates on the earliest stages of Roman history, observing with emphasis that in the beginning the Romans were in fact Greeks. Hence, in his view, the acceptability of their governance of the world, in the execution of which the Romans will naturally want to take advantage of the culture of their forebears. Dionysius of Halicarnassus writes in Greek and primarily through, though not exclusively for, a Greek audience. By contrast, Livy, from 59 BCE to CE 17, who covered Roman history in 142 books from its origins to 9 BCE, wrote in Latin for Roman consumption. His purpose was moral, and the chief attraction of his work was literary. Livy's account of Roman history became an instant classic and soon eclipsed all his sources and predecessors, with the exception of Polybius. Livy, although a diligent reader as well as a gifted writer, was only as good as a historian as his sources permitted. Nonetheless, for latter generations, his became the orthodox summary of early Roman history, and so naturally Plutarch turns to Livy for the authentic Roman perspective on Rome's conquest of Carthage and of Greece. Plutarch confesses that he never became entirely proficient in Latin, but he knew he needed to know enough to read his most important Roman sources, and for Plutarch's purposes, Livy was quite simply indispensable. Concerning magistracies, money, and measurements, as well as Roman names. Plutarch assumes his readers are more or less familiar with Roman political offices, and so a brief introduction here may lend some clarity later. Each year, the people elected 2 consuls, the city's supreme magistrates, and the chief commanders of its armies. They also elected praetors, the number of whom eventually reached 6 by the 2nd century BCE. Although obliged to defer to the consuls, they shared the same powers, commanding in the field and in Rome, routinely managing the courts and summoning the Senate to its duties. The remaining magistracies looked after the material fabric of the city and managed its festivals, and quaestors, financial officers, and administrative assistants to the consuls and praetors. It was the duty of the tribunes of the people to ensure that no legislation or senatorial decree was passed that diminished the rights of the people. These they block with their veto, and to protect the rights of individual citizens when they were jeopardized by magisterial excesses. Tribunes could also propose legislation. Every 5 years or so, the Romans elected 2 censors, who conducted a census, issued public contracts for significant building projects, like roads or aqueducts, selected the Senate, exercised moral supervision over the leading classes, and performed a ritual purification of the city. When the authority of any magistrate was extended beyond his term of office, which was often the case for consuls and praetors, they became pro-magistrates, and so were called proconsuls or pro-praetors. There was also an extraordinary magistrate, the dictator. Appointed in states of emergency, the dictator held absolute power, unchecked by any colleague. His task was to restore the city's order and safety, often simply by conducting elections when there was no authority competent to do so, but at other times by taking charge of the army in situations so dire that any divisions in command were deemed dangerous. The dictator was assisted by a magistrate called Master of the Horse, or Magister Equitum, his cavalry commander. It was a routine for Romans to proceed through the magistracies by way of a praetorship, followed, if they were successful, by the praetorship and consulship. The aedileship was never obligatory, nor was it the tribunate, from which patricians were excluded. Of course, the most important Roman monetary terms for this are the as, or the sesterce, and denarius, tariffed at the rate of 10 ases equals 4 sesterces equals 1 denarius. Around 140 BCE, the denarius was re-tariffed and became worth 16 aces. The denarius was in fact only introduced in the year 216 BCE, but is often used by ancient writers to describe values and costs even in earlier periods. Plutarch equates the Roman denarius with the Greek drachma, with the result that 6,000 denarii, or 24,000 sesterces, equals 1 talent. Modern equivalences can be misleading, but it is perhaps helpful to recognize that by the late Republic, an ordinary laborer would expect to earn 3 to 6 sesterces for a day's effort, while a Roman soldier was paid 1,200 sesterces each year. By contrast, a Roman knight was worth at least 400,000 sesterces, and a senator at least 1,000,000 sesterces. Greek writers measure distances in stades. One stade consists of 6 plethra. A plethron is 100 Greek feet, but Greek feet varied significantly. An Olympic foot, for instance, was 320 millimeters, or 12.6 inches, whereas an Attic foot was 297.7 millimeters, or 11.64 inches. It is not obvious that Plutarch was very troubled about consistency in this matter. A Roman mile was 5,000 Roman feet, 1,480 meters, or 4,855.5 modern feet. Plutarch tends to equate 1 Roman mile with 8 stades. All Romans had 2 names, a personal first name, praenomen, and a clan or Gentile name, nomen, to which was often added a third name, or cognomen, which, in combination with the nomen, defined one's family, one's branch of the larger clan. For instance, Marcus Porcius Cato was a member of the clan of Porci, but his specific family were the Porci Catons. Plutarch is inconsistent in his use of Roman names. Cato is always Cato, but Titus Quinctius Flaminius is always Titus. This use of the first name in narratives is very much a non-Roman habit. Romans also employed honorific names, the most common in this being the name given Publius Cornelius Scipio, who after defeating Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, was called Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. Plutarch incorrectly believed that Coriolanus was so called for a similar reason. And there concludes the introduction to Plutarch's The Rise of Rome, translated by Ian Scott Kilvert and Jeffrey Tatum and Christopher Pelling.